This is episode 417 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, happy new fiscal year and a lot of laws taking effect in New Mexico. Of course, happy Independence Day as well.
Yes, happy Independence Day, United States of America.
Yes, and keen observers, regular viewers or listeners, perhaps of the Tipping Point, New Mexico show may uh, notice that I'm not in studio with you today, doing some traveling with the family, and yes, it is the beginning of a new year of laws and policies, and there's some impactful policies that I want to talk about today. For starters, the gross receipts tax, as was passed in the last legislative session, drops slightly. Here in Albuquerque, we go from 7.875 to 7.75% on the gross receipts tax. That's all well and good, but not really going to change the game, especially after years and years of pretty rapid increases in the gross receipts tax. That's good news, though. Some small bit of tax relief, and we'll take it. And then mandatory paid sick leave, on the other hand, begins. Employers are going to have to allocate an hour of sick leave for every 30 hours each of their employees works. And the law will also require that employers provide a written policy to current employees and new hires that details the policy and provide tracking. So, in some ways, the sick leave itself is not the news story, it's the tracking and having to make sure that you're on top of the various sick leave needs of your employees.
Yes, Paul. And, the interesting thing, this was passed, what, a year and a half ago? And then they delayed the implementation because we're in the middle of COVID. And it brings to light kind of, I don't know, modern legislation and then how, excuse me, how it's implemented. So this thing's been on the books a long time. They delayed it, and yet the rulemaking, the specifics about exactly what you need to do to implement this, came out just a few days before it went into effect. So, and then you can say, well, people knew about the law. Well, this is, and we'll talk about this more. I think when it comes to the Supreme Court rulings of the U.S., is that there's this thing in between the law and how laws are administered called rulemaking, and if nothing else, the state of New Mexico was mighty slow to get that out the door, amazingly slow. So, and it's one of those, if you use a payroll system, whether it be manual or absolutely computerized, there's things you're going to need to do. And there's no out of this. If you have one employee, you count. So a lot of things like this that are pretty burdensome to do the administration on. They'll say, well, yeah, if you have less than 5 employees, 50 employees, 500 employees, but not this. You have one employee, this counts on you. And there's no opting out. So you're in it.
Yeah, I think that is the most noteworthy component of this particular law relative to other similar laws is that they did not exempt any number of employees in it. So you're in the law no matter how few employees you may have. And of course, it is a new fiscal year. That also means that the new state budget that was just passed kicks in with its massive 15% increase. Um, you know, Social Security, taxation reduced dramatically, uh, military pension taxation reduced as well. So, certainly some good things that are taking effect this July 1st. But overall, it's a mixed bag because the one business oriented new proposition, the new legislation is really going to have some impacts on those small businesses in particular because big businesses they can hire compliance officers, payroll, and HR people, whereas onesie twosie shops and certain nonprofits will have to implement things all by themselves. So it's a mixed bag there as usual, but could be a lot of really good things happening, but we have to focus on that.
Yeah, and Paul, there are businesses before this had sick leave policies. It was addressed, and during the COVID, the federal government took over and would provide for payment of sick leave. Albeit, yeah, there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of things that need to be done. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be a sick leave policy, and COVID I think was the impetus for this, but it is interesting. New Mexico tends to take the track that is most burdensome on small business on many policies over the last many years, and certainly in the COVID era, it's tough to be a small business in New Mexico, and the kind of numbers we've seen for business closures and small businesses are bearing that out.
Yeah. Now, moving on, in terms of public policies being considered and discussed and passed in other states, Arizona is and has been a real leader in education policy and school choice. Uh, our neighboring state has just enacted what are called empowerment scholarship accounts, ESAs, or education savings accounts in many other states. But there had been a system in place in Arizona for several years for kids in low performing district schools, children of active duty military personnel, and a few other categories. I think special needs. Yeah, those are another one. So uh, there'd been smaller versions of this program, which is essentially the money following the child. And sure enough, Arizona has now made their educational choice program uh, universal in nature. So, big happenings out of Arizona. I wrote about this in a post at Heirs of Enchantment and showed the all important fourth grade reading score for each state. New Mexico, and yeah, while this is a new thing going forward for Arizona, uh, the choice and the improvement in educational opportunity in Arizona has been going for more than a decade. I looked at the fourth grade reading scores from the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, and going back to 2002, 2003, Arizona and New Mexico were comparable on the NAEP. And then, really starting in about 2009, Arizona started to separate itself from New Mexico, and the chart makes it clear now that Arizona's fourth grade reading scores, and if you're not reading by fourth grade, that's when a whole host of negative outcomes are starting to be more likely. So fourth grade reading is really a critical it's a critical time post for children. So it's something that Arizona did and is doing right.
Yeah, and Paul, we've seen lots of other states have had progress in educational attainment with various things that they're doing, and New Mexico is really focused on the financial side, the inputs, the money in, and we will see. I'm not saying I'm not sure New Mexico would do this, but there's been very little even explicit focus on how we're doing and how our test scores are, and that's the piece that's missing, and we'll see. So as other states do things that are working, at some point New Mexico may get the message that maybe they ought to do something too. But right now, it's been a mighty slow period the last few years with regard to, I don't even know what you call it, reform, focus, whatever, on, getting the test scores up in New Mexico.
Well, on the issue of choice, you know, we've worked on this issue pretty much from day one because it began as the core of what the Rio Grande Foundation really took on going back to 2006 when I started. Then Governor Bill Richardson was at least somewhat supportive of a different mechanism for educational choice called tax credits. I don't need to go into that right now, but it would have enabled poor and low income students in New Mexico to choose the school that worked for them. That unfortunately was not something that the Democrat controlled legislature, despite Democrat sponsors of legislation along those lines, they were not willing to go there. Then we had Susana Martinez, who was much more accountability focused, top down. That's something that, quite honestly, she uh, did not embrace in terms of the school choice initiatives, money following the students, and explicitly refused to talk or promote actual choice beyond government schools, which, while charter schools are wonderful, charter schools are still funded and have to be really under government control to a greater extent than, say, most private schools. So it's been a long road, but Ron Ketty, who is, of course, running for governor, and all the other candidates on the Republican side for governor really expressed support for this kind of money following the children school choice. So we've come a long way, baby, even if it hasn't been implemented yet.
Yeah, so yeah, I think it's time for implementation of something, some model going forward that's going to get things moving in the right direction. And as you say, yeah, even under Susana Martinez is very top down, accountability oriented, but some of the things like uh, elimination of social promotion that were the one of the hallmarks of her plan, those never ever saw the light of day. They were fought tooth and nail, to the point where back then the legislature wouldn't even confirm her education cabinet secretary. So it was a pretty ugly 8 years with regard to education policy in New Mexico. Albeit New Mexico does have the charter schools, and that is, as you say, that there's a lot of things that have been in play. A lot of things have been talked about. Some have been implemented, but we're still maybe a little bit behind on where we need to be.
Yeah, and kind of the discussion, quite frankly, has moved because back in the day, so to speak, and we're talking Richardson administration, not ancient history, but back in that era, there were a number of Democrat politicians who would embrace things like tax credits for school choice. And the idea is people donate to a 501c3 scholarship organization, and that scholarship organization turns around and provides the scholarships to low income kids. You can do that right now under the federal tax code, but if you create a tax credit system at the state level, you can do a lot more with that money, generate a lot more donations for the choice programs and create a more robust program. But folks like Bill Richardson, and he's really symbolic of just that short time period and how far that discussion has gone with the Democrats. They're just pretty much unwilling to embrace that kind of choice. Back in those days, Ed Rendell, the governor of Pennsylvania, Janet Napolitano of Arizona, Democrats, both, they were willing to sign and expand those programs, whereas it really seems like the education discussion on the Democrat side of the aisle is now totally under the rubric of the unions, and there's very little willingness to challenge those unions and their power. And Wally, I'm going to shift slightly because it's the same basic conversation, but taken to the COVID pandemic lockdowns. And, I don't know enough about the politics of Sweden and their school system. I do know that they have great school choice in Sweden, but we also know that during the pandemic, Sweden was roundly criticized by many for not locking down its economy, its society, and ultimately its schools and its children. And they kept their K 12, the equivalent, open throughout the COVID pandemic. And according to a brand new study in the International Journal of Education Research, there was no learning loss in Sweden during the pandemic, and the study cites evidence from primary school reading assessments. So, a very different path from us here in New Mexico when it comes to dealing with the pandemic, uh, setting aside Sweden's potential differences that would be interesting to unlock and expand upon if we had the ability to do a lot of international comparisons with New Mexico. But we know, generally speaking, New Mexico finds itself at the very bottom of the education list. The sad aspect of this is that due to the COVID policies of our current governor, uh, at the behest of the unions, I might add, we really further lost grounds, not just against U.S. states, but against other countries, including Sweden.
Yes, and Paul, the always the big issue with regard to shutting down of small businesses, having the schools closed, is in the COVID management era was that was going to do whatever these wonderful things to 2 weeks to slow the spread. It's going to keep things from coming back. Time to get vaccinated, and there were some that took that approach with a very strong emphasis, like New Mexico. There were states that took a much weaker approach to that and are much more of a keep things open, keep things going. And as we look back, with hindsight to aid us, which believe me, we did not have that in the midst of the worst of the COVID pandemic. It was with hindsight to aid us, though, it was certainly clear that there was a lot of damage done both to businesses, to education, to society as a whole. And the COVID benefits of that are minor, if at all. So, that's where we find ourselves. So, in a very deep hole in a lot of places.
Yeah, and while there was a lot of ignorance, if you will, about what COVID was going to do to various populations and groups and how serious it was going to be, uh, pretty much by the fall of the 2020-2021 school year, there had been extensive writing and discussion of uh, the fact that COVID's impact on kids, young people in classrooms was really insignificant, and that keeping those schools open made a lot of sense. We were saying that there was a lot of writing going on in mainstream publications about this, but there was also a clear pattern of the unions in blue districts, blue cities, blue areas of the country, that those unions were the most uh, skeptical of getting kids and teachers back in the classroom. And we know that this governor is beholden to those unions for her electoral uh, possibilities and financial underpinning for her election. Uh, Maybe that's not entirely why she did what she did, but uh, we've talked on this podcast about a report from Renaissance Learning showing that New Mexico students had the very worst learning loss during COVID, um, due to on the reading side of things, whereas on the math side, we saw among the worst learning loss, and we talked about the reasons for that. And I'll reiterate from this particular report. The proportion of students with weak reading skills did not increase in Sweden during the pandemic. And students from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds in Sweden were not especially affected. It's easy for Americans to maybe lose sight of the fact that, yes, there are poor people in Sweden, but yeah, they they did not lose any additional learning or any learning that they might otherwise have been able to access. So, very stark difference from where things stand or stood in the United States. And, while Sweden is a very, very different population with different dynamics than the United States, uh, overall, their COVID performance was very good, actually better than the United States. And you could say, well, it has to do with these various population factors. Well, my only point is that there is no clear way to show that states in the United States that locked their kids out of school, that locked down, did significantly better on COVID than did their more open peers. And internationally, the same is very true. There's a lot more at play here in terms of characteristics of individual societies, cultures, physical fitness, etc., than just some kind of straight line to the policies. And we're not going to dwell on those policies, but that's just the facts.
Yeah, yeah, and just two quick points to wrap this up is that one, the first year of the pandemic, things were really shut down and there wasn't a lot of data. But then the second year, the exact same policies continued on. And then from a New Mexico point of view, is quote unquote distance learning with the poor level of technology many places was just a joke. There was places where they probably worked pretty well, but man, there were a lot of rural places that have such bad internet connections, and the level of capability technologically within a lot of these families and homes just wasn't there. And is it surprising that we because of that went down? It's not to me. And the other thing that's just sad is we were not at a real high level going down. We were low and we went lower.
That's exactly right. All right, Wally. Well, it's been an eventful Supreme Court decision making season, or handing down of decisions. I don't know exactly what they call it, but every year at this time, although it's just concluded, the Supreme Court of the United States hands down decisions that they've been working on throughout the year. And uh, before we dive into one of the critical decisions that they just handed down, I will say that uh, this particular Supreme Court has been at the very top. They've been at the very best courts in the entire history of this country, my lifetime. I can't recall a Supreme Court that has made more correct decisions along the lines of the U.S. Constitution and uh, federalism and restoring the way government is, as I see it, as the Rio Grande Foundation sees it, and I believe the founding fathers saw it, the very best approach to government we've ever seen from a court.
Yes, and the general theme is that the federal constitution has limits for the federal government, and powers not enumerated and assigned to the federal government are for the states. And we've spent a long time, 50 years going in the other direction away from that. And there have been a lot of restrictive rulings with regard to what the federal government's role is and responsibility vis-a-vis the states. And then also, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about it, relative to the power of the legislature relative to the power of the executive branch to just go off and, in essence, make laws without going through the legislature.
Yeah, and the case at question is the West Virginia versus EPA decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. It's there's complexity here, but very relevant to the U.S. economy and, quite frankly, very relevant to some decisions that have been undertaken in New Mexico, although not directly impacting New Mexico's decisions. And I think that uh, is one aspect of what the court's talking about here. But let's jump into this. So we have this Clean Air Act that goes back to the 1960s. 1963 was last amended in 1990. And the Clean Air Act set up standards for certain pollutants under federal law that all states, all businesses would have to comply with. And what had happened, and what typically does tend to happen with these policies, is that uh, politicians find additional problems that they want to solve with the same hammer that they were using for other prior problems. And the question was, uh, and this goes back to the Obama administration, which is that uh, the Clean Power Plan was the Obama administration's effort to uh, allow the federal government to create a cap and trade system nationwide using the Clean Air Plan as the platform, the legislative justification, if you will, to do that. Um, and the court said, no, this isn't what you can do. This was never authorized under the Clean Air Act. If you want to uh, use this federal legislation or any federal legislation to specifically set up a cap and trade program, if you want to start regulating CO2, you need congressional approval. This is Congress's uh, purview. You can't just take a piece of legislation that was passed in 1990. Before the real, there was really even very little conversation about uh, the issue of CO2 and what impact that may or may not have. So basically, the uh, Supreme Court said, look, this is Congress's purview. They need to act if you want to do this kind of program. Uh, Interestingly, very in line with, in my opinion, kind of the broader philosophy of Roe v. Wade, very different decisions, but the court is saying, look, if this is not our decision, they are devolving decision making power away from themselves and towards the uh, the Congress or the legislatures. They are taking power out of the hands of unelected bureaucrats or one person, i.e., the president, and they are restoring that power the uh, to the elected bodies, which again is the way it should be done.
Yes, and what we've seen from the federal government, and there's a number of ways that it comes about. Is that you have executive orders, you have policies of these agencies where they do rulemakings on top of old law, and in essence create new law without going back to the legislature. And yeah, this is a dramatic turnaround from that. Paul, over the past couple of decades, there's almost what I call nameplate recognition. So you have environment in the name of your department, you can do whatever you want on the environment. And that's just not the way our system of government is set up. The executive branch administers the laws, not things that are, cut from whole cloth or made up by the administration that's in power, whether it be the a Democratic or a Republican administration. There are limits in our system of three branches of government.
Yeah, and of course, electricity regulation, those powers have typically been at the state level. That is a marketplace that has been regulated through state agencies, the legislature being one, in New Mexico, the Public Regulation Commission being the other. And other states, including New Mexico, have enacted policies relating to CO2 emissions and uh, moving the electricity generation of that particular state in a very different direction from it where it was historically. So just because the federal, Supreme Court says that because Congress hasn't done this, they have to actually do something legislatively, that doesn't mean that states can't act on their own. And in the case of New Mexico, they have. Now, whether that action is taken in a thoughtful and um, approach that's respectful of other interests, the economy, and having reliable power is a very different thing that we've talked about uh, ad nauseum on this particular podcast. But it was a very, very important decision. Now, one quick thing to note, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but there's something called the Chevron doctrine that operates at the federal level where there's kind of this, as you alluded to, a blanket authority to have these federal uh, bureaucracies like the Environmental Protection Agency act. They did not explicitly kill the Chevron doctrine and really rein in these unelected federal bureaucracies. But this decision, I think, does give and should give agencies like the EPA and others pause the next time they are being asked to enact some grandiose, very aggressive policy making approach. So I think this may be a theme with this particular court, and it's really reining in the regulatory state, and it's high time that they do that. And I know people like to talk about Congress and their inability to act and all the frustrations thereof, but the reason Congress doesn't act on a lot of things is because there's such an even split in the United States. And you see that at the federal level when you have Biden come in, set up a very ambitious regulatory system, new laws, new approaches, well, new through the regulatory system. And then you see a president like Trump come in and undo so much of that. That's not a healthy approach either. If Congress is going to act, they need to be able to cobble together uh, 60 votes to get over the filibuster, and then in the Senate, and then majorities in both of those bodies, and pass actual laws. And that doesn't mean that the laws are good. It just means that the approach, the system, needs to be better.
Yes, and in the current environment we find ourselves in, and I have a feeling there are legislators that are looking at things that they maybe have been getting what they want through these regulatory mechanisms. And the reason I think they're going to be looking at that, there's a lot of people that are probably looking at other areas of the federal bureaucracy where they believe there's been overreach well beyond their legislative authorization. And don't be surprised if there's not a lot more lawsuits brought in other areas of the bureaucracy, because believe me, the federal government and its rules and regulations are, I don't even know there's a word for it. It's immense. It's one of those like trying to comprehend what a trillion is. It's a lot. There are a lot of regulations. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of things. And a lot of it is very difficult to trace back to enabling legislation.
Yeah, exactly. So it won't get the kind of attention and maybe public facing controversy that the Roe v. Wade decision will, but West Virginia versus EPA is a very, very important decision of the Supreme Court. And it just highlights the challenges that are going to be faced as a society with regard to this supposed switch to a clean approach to generating electricity. And we'll see how New Mexico does, because other states are not going to be bullied into this by an overreaching federal government. It's one of those things that, if you have Half the states that want to pursue a bad policy, um, by that I mean anti-free market, etc. Then you have half the states that don't want to pursue the bad policy. It's a lot easier for those states pursuing bad policy to cover up their bad policies by mandating that the other half of the states have to pursue the very same policy. And that's true whether it's the minimum wage at the federal level or the Clean Power Plan or this equivalent, whatever it may be. Uh, One of the great ways that folks have to cover up bad policies is to mandate them on the entire country. And again, this was the founding fathers' design, the federal system to allow states that don't want to choose bad policies or want to experience what may or may not be a bad policy to enact those policies and see what happens and see those other states consider those policies in the future.
Yeah, and just to put a bookend on this is that we have United States of America, and the emphasis on governance has been on the America part for the last 50 years, and right now where it sure seems like we're at a turning point back to the United States and the impact that each state has and their ability to legislate relative to the federal.
Yeah, and speaking of policies, many of which have been pushed down from Congress and regulatory entities. There are unemployment data, of course, that we've found in New Mexico. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has reported that we have and have had for several months the highest unemployment rate in the nation. This is according to the May Bureau of Labor Statistics. But Wallet Hub, which is a economic tracking website that often issues interesting reports, has come out with a report looking at where businesses are having the greatest challenge finding workers. And you would kind of think it would make a certain amount of logical sense, Wally, that in states with the very lowest unemployment rates, those states would have businesses that are having the most difficulty hiring people. But that's not necessarily the case. In fact, the ability for employers to find employees has very little to do with unemployment rates. In fact, New Mexico, where you have the very highest unemployment rate, businesses are having the 23rd most challenging time finding workers. They have the 23rd most job openings of any state in the country. And Alaska has the very highest number of job openings. That's, of course, adjusted for population. New York State has the very least amount of job openings. So, some really interesting things there in the labor market. And, I think it's safe to say that New Mexico, with its also low workforce participation rate, needs to work to get more workers into the workforce, fewer workers at home, collecting government benefits, cashing checks, doing whatever they are doing, which seems to not involve working in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about this, Paul. There are a lot of issues. It's what's the match of those that are unemployed relative to the jobs that are available. That could have an impact in New Mexico. And then the other thing is that of those who are quote unquote unemployed and receiving benefits, how many of them, as you alluded to, really want to work as opposed to being, okay for the time being, collecting their unemployment benefits and waiting to see what the future holds for them, as opposed to really being active and wanting to get a job. So these are all very interesting things. And then the final thought is that, states with low unemployment, by definition, more of their workforce is employed. And so, maybe they don't need as many jobs there because those people have already come back off of unemployment to work. There is a little bit of that kind of closing of that loop, if you will, but we've not seen a lot of that closing of that loop here in New Mexico, even though there are a lot of people on the unemployment rolls.
Yeah, Utah, which is a neighboring state that constantly has a very, very low unemployment rate, is one of the states at 45 that has the fewest job openings among U.S. states. Of course, many of those other states with few job openings are some of the more liberal blue states: New York, as I mentioned, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Washington, bunch of blue states there, then California. So it's interesting. It's not something that we've typically tracked as closely as some of the other economic data and employment data, but uh, I do think that it is critical that New Mexico works on uh, whoever the next governor is, or heaven forbid it's the current governor. Either way, it really is something that would behoove us all to get more people to work in the state of New Mexico. And I'll just circle back, if you will, to the previous discussion about new laws. One of the laws that took effect is the Opportunity Scholarship Act that the governor pushed, which is like, you could say, lottery scholarship 2.0. You could have your little, now funded through the permanent through the general fund as opposed to the lottery. That program is something that I think this governor would say is her effort to get more eligible workers into the workforce long term. Obviously, if you're going to college, if you're in a full-time educational environment, your ability to work and take on a full-time job is somewhat limited. But I'm sure if you had a candid conversation with the governor, she would say that that is her approach to getting more people in New Mexico to work off the sidelines. I would be suspect of that. I think we need a lot more, vocational training, a lot more direct to job training in New Mexico. We have a population that, quite honestly, our schools don't even prepare our kids to be be workers in college jobs, college level employment, let alone for some of the more basic jobs out there. So needs to have a big change there, and I just don't think this new free college, quote unquote, is going to get the job done.
Well, and Paul, regardless of whether it eventually shows benefits for the state, the thing we've talked about at the beginning and now is that the K through 12 system and reading and math scores basic skills in a huge amount of the K through 12 population is a really big issue that needs to be addressed. And so, yeah, we will have to see.
And finally, we are at a story that I'll just thank Robert Bryce. He is a energy uh, analyst, somebody we've had out to speak at the Rio Grande Foundation, talking about the recent decision that the Biden administration made to essentially pull off tariffs on solar panels made over in China, and the fact that this decision by the Biden administration, uh, as Bryce writes in Newsweek, is pandering to the green left. And pandering to the green left, Biden is underwriting China's genocide of the Uyghurs. And a U.S. Treasury report cited by Bryce in his article notes that China, which dominates the global solar panel supply chain, there's mounting evidence that solar products and inputs at nearly every step of the production process, from raw silicon material mining and final solar module assembly, all of them are linked or known to forced labor programs. So we have this desire for especially liberal politicians, folks like Martin Heinrich, folks like the president, to keep the solar panels coming theoretically so we can produce more inexpensive green solar energy. And the U.S. Treasury's own reporting mechanisms have uh, uncovered what they consider to be strong evidence that Chinese solar panels are made with slave labor. And if you're making things with slave labor, chances are you're also not following a lot of the more picayune environmental concerns and regulations that might be followed here in the United States. So it's a really big problem, and I think one that unfortunately the media is going to ignore because the benefit of the solar panels is where they're focusing their attention.
Yeah, and then Paul, just a real quick point on that. In addition to all the things that you talked about, we also have what I'll call strategic supply chain issues that have definitely come to the fore during COVID. But by strategic, as we use more and more solar panels, and then if more and more of those come from China and there's no industry of any kind to produce those in the United States, that could be something that basically could be used against the U.S. economy. Even as this quote unquote renewable energy source that's not dependent on quote unquote foreign oil or the oil market, we could have the renewables market be held hostage to some level if things go how they seem to be going right now.
Yeah, despite the lack of parallels, there's a lot of talk among supporters of so-called green energy about the oh, you don't have enough natural gas or oil from Russia. Well, just go green. Just do something with the preferred power sources, solar panels or whatever. But as you rightly point out, those have their own significant supply chain issues. And there's also been the talk of just buy a electric vehicle. Well, there's a very long wait time for many of the electric vehicle models out there as well, also due to supply chains. But heaven forbid those were deployed on a very widespread basis. And Wally, as mentioned, we're on the road. Uh, you get out on the open road in the United States, and we traveled. We're in Tennessee now, but taking a lot of trips around. Haven't seen many Teslas on those interstates, not many electric vehicles either. I don't think those are as viable for those big road trips as many other vehicles with the gas powered engine. So we'll end it there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.